There were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organisations.
For decades, one of the biggest secrets inside Buckingham Palace was hidden in plain sight. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth did not always sleep under the same roof. They lived separately. Different rooms, different schedules, sometimes different buildings entirely. The world assumed their marriage was picture perfect. It was not. And now, for the first time, their own daughter princess and has broken the silence, and what she revealed is turning everything we thought we knew completely upside down. Princess and does not talk often. That is what makes this so important. She is known across Britain as the hardest working royal. No drama. No interviews. No emotional confessions. She keeps her head down and she gets the job done. So when and opens her mouth about something personal, something this personal, people listen. And they should. Because what she shared about her parents' private life is not just surprising. It is heartbreaking in a way that nobody expected. For years, royal watchers noticed something strange. Philip was often absent from the Queen's side during private hours. Official engagements, yes. Public appearances, yes. But behind the palace gates, the two lived in a way that felt more like two powerful individuals sharing a kingdom than a couple sharing a life. Separate bedrooms were confirmed long ago, but the full picture was always kept carefully out of reach. And changed that. In a rare moment of reflection, she spoke about her father with a depth of emotion that caught many people off guard. She described Philip not just as a royal figure, but as a man. A real man who carried enormous weight every single day. A man who made sacrifices that most people will never fully understand. And buried inside her words was a truth about her parents' living arrangement that finally started to make sense. What she revealed was not a scandal. It was something more complicated than that. It was the story of two people who loved each other deeply but were trapped inside a system that made normal love almost impossible. The crown came first. It always came first. And Philip, more than anyone, paid the price for that. Some reports suggest that the separate living arrangement was not a sign of distance. It was actually a coping mechanism, a way for both of them to function inside an impossible life. Philip needed space to breathe. The Queen needed space to rule. And somehow, that unusual setup became the foundation of a 73-year marriage that outlasted almost everything. Anne's words cracked open a door that has been locked for a very long time. And behind that door is a story about duty, sacrifice, loneliness, and a love that survived in spite of everything working against it. The question is, what exactly did Anne say? And why did she choose to say it now? Most couples fight about small things. Who does the dishes? Who forgets anniversaries? But inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, the fights were never small. They were about power, about identity, about who gets to lead and who has to follow. And for Philip and Elizabeth, that tension started on the very first day of their marriage and never truly went away. What Anne revealed pulls back the curtain on an arrangement so unusual that most ordinary people would struggle to even imagine it. Let us start with the facts. Buckingham Palace is not a home. It is an institution. It has over 700 rooms, dozens of staff, a schedule that runs like a government operation because it essentially is one. Living inside that building is not like living in a house. It is like living inside a machine. And that machine was built for one person above all others. The Queen. Every room, every corridor, every decision inside that palace revolved around her role, her duties, her position. Philip had his own space within that world. But it was always her world. Observers who spent time around the royal household noted something that was rarely spoken about openly. Philip and the Queen operated on almost entirely separate schedules. They had different staff, different offices, different daily routines. And while they would come together for meals, for appearances, for family moments, there was a clear and deliberate separation built into the structure of their daily lives. This was not accidental. It was designed. Some reports suggest that the arrangement actually began quite early in their marriage. When Elizabeth became queen in 1952, everything changed overnight. Philip was no longer just a husband. He was the husband of the most powerful woman in Britain. And the palace system, with all of its traditions and protocols, made sure he never forgot the difference. He walked behind her in public. He bowed to her in official settings. He was given a title but not a role that truly matched his ambition, and has spoken about her father's position with a clarity that is rare. She understood, perhaps better than any of her siblings, what it cost Philip to exist inside that structure. She watched it happen in real time. She saw the frustration behind his eyes at official events. She saw how he channeled that energy into his own projects, his own passions, his own way of carving out meaning inside a life that had been largely mapped out for him by forces beyond his control. The two homes arrangement, which became more defined in the later years of their marriage, was in many ways a solution to a problem that had no perfect answer. Philip needed autonomy. The Queen needed stability. And living with a degree of separation gave both of them room to be who they needed to be. Many believe this was actually the secret to their endurance. Not closeness, but a very carefully managed distance that kept the love alive without letting the institution crush it entirely. And saw all of this. And she has never forgotten it. If you are enjoying this breakdown, like this video and subscribe for more deep analysis. There is a version of Prince Philip that most people know. The sharp wit. The controversial comments. The man who stood slightly behind his wife for 7 decades and never once complained in public. But that version is incomplete, because behind the composed exterior was a man who gave up more than most people will ever give up in a lifetime. And according to those closest to him, including Anne, that sacrifice left marks that never fully healed. Think about what Philip actually surrendered. He was a naval officer, a decorated war hero. A man who had fought in some of the most dangerous waters of World War II and earned genuine respect through genuine courage. He was not born into a quiet life. He was built for action, for leadership, for command. The sea was his world. And when Elizabeth became queen, he walked away from all of it. Not reluctantly, but completely. He gave up his career. He gave up his name. He even gave up his family's surname so that the royal line could continue under the Windsor name rather than his own. That last part is something people often overlook. Philip wanted his children to carry the name Mountbatten. It was his name, his identity, his connection to his own family history. The palace said no. Tradition said no. And Philip, who had already given so much, was asked to give that too. Some reports suggest he was devastated by that decision, that it struck at something deep and personal in a way that even the loss of his naval career had not, and has spoken about her father's inner life with a tenderness that reveals just how closely she observed him. She described a man who processed his frustration not through words but through action. When Philip felt trapped, he worked. He threw himself into projects. The Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme. His environmental work. His role in shaping royal engagements. He built an entire second identity out of the space he was allowed to occupy. But observers who watched him closely noted that there was always something unresolved beneath the surface. The separate living arrangement has to be understood in this context, because it was not just about personal preference or royal protocol. It was about survival. Philip needed a space that was entirely his own. A room where he was not the Queen's husband. Where he was just Philip. Where nobody bowed to him or walked carefully around his feelings or reminded him of everything he had sacrificed simply by being present in the room. Many believe that without that space, without that breathing room, the marriage would have fractured far earlier than anyone would like to admit. And understood this about her father in a way that was deeply personal. She is, in many ways, the most Philip-like of all the royal children. Direct. Unsentimental. Hard-working. She inherited his way of moving through the world. And because of that, she understood his pain in a way that perhaps nobody else in the family truly did. She watched a great man shrink himself every single day to fit inside a role that was never designed for someone of his caliber. And she never forgot what that looked like. The question that remains is what was happening on the other side of that marriage. What was the Queen experiencing while Philip was quietly carrying all of this weight? The public image of Buckingham Palace is one of order, tradition, and quiet dignity. Perfectly pressed uniforms. Carefully worded statements. Emotions kept firmly behind closed doors. But behind that image was a household that was, in many ways, just as complicated and just as painful as any ordinary family. And what was happening between Philip and the Queen during their most difficult years is something that Anne's words have only recently begun to bring into focus. Let us be clear about one thing first. This was not a broken marriage. It was not a cold arrangement between two people who had stopped caring. Every person who spent real time around Philip and the Queen described something that could not be faked. A connection. A shorthand. A way of communicating with just a glance that only comes from decades of genuine intimacy. The love was real. Nobody who observed them closely has ever seriously questioned that. But love does not make everything easy. And inside the palace, easy was never really an option. The early years of their marriage were particularly difficult. Elizabeth had become queen at just 25 years old. She was thrust into a role of enormous responsibility almost overnight following the death of her father, King George VI. The grief was immense. The pressure was crushing. And Philip, who had only been married to her for 5 years at that point, suddenly found himself living inside a completely different reality than the one he had signed up for. Some reports suggest that the adjustment nearly broke them both. Philip struggled to find his footing. The palace old guard did not make it easy for him. Courtiers who had served the royal family for generations viewed him with suspicion. He was seen as an outsider. Too modern. Too forceful. Too independent. There were battles behind closed doors about his role, his influence, his access to decisions that affected the family he was now part of. And he lost many of those battles quietly, without the public ever knowing they had been fought. The Queen, for her part, was caught between two worlds. She loved Philip deeply, but she also carried the weight of the crown in a way that left very little room for anything else. Observers noticed that she found it genuinely difficult to separate the woman from the monarch. Even in private, even with her husband, the role had consumed her so completely that stepping outside of it, even briefly, required enormous effort. And has hinted at this dynamic with careful but revealing language. She has described moments where her mother's sense of duty created distance that was never intended. Not coldness, not indifference, but an absorption in responsibility so total that everything else, including the needs of the people closest to her, sometimes faded into the background. This is where the separate living arrangement takes on a new and deeper meaning. It was not a rejection. It was an adaptation. Two people who could not change the system they lived inside, finding a way to protect what mattered most to them within it. Philip got his space. The Queen got her structure. And the marriage, fragile in ways the public never saw, somehow held together through it all. Many believe the palace walls witnessed arguments that were never recorded. Silences that lasted too long. Moments of real pain that were processed entirely alone because the alternative, showing vulnerability inside that environment, was simply not possible for either of them. But here is what is remarkable. Through all of it, they stayed. They chose each other again and again inside a life that made choosing each other extraordinarily difficult. And Anne, who watched all of this unfold from the inside, carries that knowledge with her every single day. What she has chosen to share is only part of the story. But it is the most honest part anyone from inside that family has ever offered. If you are enjoying this breakdown, like this video and subscribe for more deep analysis. There is something powerful about a person who watches everything and says nothing for years. Who absorbs the full weight of a family's truth and carries it quietly while the rest of the world builds stories out of half-information and speculation. That is exactly what Princess Anne did for decades. She knew. She saw. She understood. And she kept it all locked inside with a discipline that is almost impossible to comprehend. And is not like her brothers. Charles processed his pain publicly. Andrew created scandals that filled newspaper front pages for years. Edward stayed carefully in the background and said as little as possible about everything. But Anne operated differently from all of them. She watched. She absorbed. She formed her own conclusions. And she protected her parents with a fierce and quiet loyalty that never wavered even when the stories being told about them were incomplete or simply wrong. People who know and well describe her as someone with an extraordinary memory. She forgets nothing. She notices everything. And she is deeply uncomfortable with versions of events that do not match what she actually witnessed with her own eyes. This is part of what makes her recent decision to speak so significant. because and does not talk unless she has something real to say. What she kept hidden for so long was the full emotional landscape of her parents' marriage. She watched her father navigate humiliation with dignity. She watched her mother carry loneliness inside the most public life imaginable. She saw the moments of genuine warmth between them that the cameras never caught. The private jokes. The quiet companionship at the end of long, exhausting days. The way Philip could make the Queen laugh when nobody else could reach her. And she also saw the harder moments. The distance. The frustration. The weight of two people trying to love each other inside a structure that was fundamentally not designed for love. Some reports suggest that Anne was always closer to Philip than any of her siblings. They shared a directness that Charles never had and that the younger children never fully developed. Philip saw himself in a way that created a bond between them that went beyond the typical parent and child relationship. He trusted her. And she, in turn, understood him in a way that was uniquely deep. This is why what she has chosen to reveal carries such weight. She is not speaking from the outside looking in. She is speaking from the inside. From years of direct observation. From real conversations with both of her parents during their most private moments. When Anne says something about Philip and the Queen, it is not speculation. It is testimony. And her testimony about the living arrangement, about the reasons behind it, about what it meant for their marriage, dismantles a version of events that has been circulating for years. The version that suggested distance meant dysfunction. That separate rooms meant a loveless union. That the unusual structure of their private life was evidence of something broken rather than something carefully and deliberately constructed to survive. And has made it clear that she watched two people who loved each other find a way to make that love work inside impossible circumstances. But she has also made it clear that the cost was real. Philip paid that cost every single day. And the Queen, in her own way, paid it too. The difference was that Philip's payment was visible to those who looked closely enough. The restlessness. The sharp edges. The need for space and autonomy that never fully went away no matter how many years passed. And saw all of it. She catalogued it inside herself with the precision of someone who understood that one day, when the time was right, the truth deserved to be told properly. That time has apparently come. And what she still has left to reveal about the most complicated royal marriage in modern history is perhaps the most important part of all. We have spent a long time looking at the details. The separate rooms. The sacrifices. The frustration. The quiet loyalty of a daughter who watched everything and said nothing for decades. But now it is time to step back and look at the full picture. Because when you put all of it together, what Philip and the Queen built between them is not just a royal story. It is a human story. And it is one of the most complicated, most painful, and most quietly remarkable love stories of the 20th century. Start with the beginning. Philip and Elizabeth fell in love young. Genuinely young. She was 13 when she first noticed him. He was 18 and already magnetic in the way that certain people are magnetic before they have even done anything worth noticing. By the time they married in 1947, the country was still recovering from the war, and the wedding felt like a moment of brightness inside a long period of darkness. The world fell in love with them together. And for a brief window of time, life was almost ordinary. Then the crown arrived. And ordinary left and never came back. What Anne's words have helped clarify is that the life Philip and the Queen built after 1952 was not the life either of them had originally imagined. It was something they constructed piece by piece out of necessity. Out of duty. Out of a determination to hold something real together inside a world that was constantly pulling them in different directions. The separate living arrangement was one piece of that construction. But it was not the most important piece. The most important piece was the decision, made quietly and repeatedly over 73 years, to keep choosing each other. To keep showing up. To keep finding ways to connect across the distance that their extraordinary circumstances created between them. That decision was never announced. It was never celebrated publicly. It simply happened, day after day, year after year, in the small invisible moments that make up a real marriage. Observers who were present during the final years of Philip's life have described something deeply moving. A tenderness between them that had softened with age. The sharp edges of their earlier years had smoothed out over time. What remained was something quieter and more durable than passion. It was companionship at the deepest level. the kind that only comes from surviving everything together, and has spoken about her father's final years with a grief that is still clearly present beneath her composed exterior. She lost not just a parent but a confidant, the one person in the family who truly spoke her language. And in losing him, she also lost the last living witness to a version of her parents' marriage that the world never fully saw or understood. Some reports suggest that Philip's death in April 2021 affected the Queen more profoundly than she ever allowed the public to see. She described him openly as her strength and stay. Those words were not protocol. They were not written by a speechwriter. They came from somewhere real and deep and private. From a woman who understood, perhaps only fully at the end, what it meant to have had someone like Philip beside her for so long. Many believe that without Philip, the Queen lost something that could not be replaced by duty or tradition or the comfort of routine. She lost the one person who had known her completely, not as a monarch, not as a symbol, but as a woman, as Elizabeth, the girl who had fallen in love with a brilliant, restless naval officer and spent the rest of her life navigating the impossible distance between who she was and what she was required to be. And carries all of this now. The memories, the understanding, the truth about a marriage that the world thought it knew but never really did. And her decision to begin speaking, carefully and selectively, about what she witnessed is a gift. Not just to royal historians or to the people who followed her parents' lives for decades, but to anyone who has ever loved someone inside circumstances that made love difficult. Because the lesson of Philip and Elizabeth is not that love conquers all. It is something more honest and more useful than that. It is that love endures when two people decide, again and again, that endurance is worth the cost. Philip paid that cost with his freedom. The Queen paid it with her vulnerability. And together they built something that outlasted almost every challenge thrown at it, and knows this better than anyone alive. And in finally choosing to speak, she is making sure that the real story, not the polished official version but the complicated human truth beneath it, is not lost to history. That is the greatest act of loyalty she could offer to the memory of both of her parents. Not silence, not protection, but truth, delivered carefully, honestly, and at exactly the right moment. Some love stories are beautiful because they are perfect. This one is beautiful because it was not. Because it survived anyway. Because two people who had every reason to drift apart kept finding their way back to each other across every obstacle the world placed between them. That is the marriage princess and has finally given us permission to see clearly. And now that we can see it, it is impossible to look away. If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into the lives behind the palace walls. Your support helps us keep bringing you the real stories that others overlook.